question that led me to do this this study that I did is really trying to translate the popular talk. In other words, what we all sit around the table, and I'm sitting around a table with people, and people say, well, you know, anti-Semitism, horrible things are going on campus, et cetera, to translate it into something that we could do some empirical data, that we actually see what's doing. So I turned to a colleague of mine at UCLA, a friend of mine, Rabbi Chaim Seidler-Feller. You know, he's the director of, he's a very well-known person, director of the Hillel at UCLA. UCLA had a very well-known incident this year of BDS issues they had there. I put together a survey of Hillel directors, of which there's 120 in the United States. And Chaim helped write a letter getting people to respond to an online survey that we did. We got 59 responses, which is about half of the Hillel directors, which for an internet survey, that's considered pretty good. And what we have over here are the responses of campus professionals. So these are people that are day in, day out, year in, year out on the campuses, as opposed to students who have a shelf life of about 2+ years. So even though they're 4 years on campus, the first year they're still learning where everything is. The last year they don't care about anything anymore. And in between you get to use, you know, they get some sort of interaction. So that's really what we looked at. From a statistical point of view, you usually expect about a 10 or 11% response rate. We got a 50% response rate, which is very, very good. And I think part of the reason for that is because we had one of the well-known Hillel directors asking people to respond. In terms of margin of error, those of you that are familiar with the concept of margin of error that you hear from Gallup polls and surveying, the margin of error here was a little bit high, is about 9 plus or minus 9. But as you'll see from the data, the effect size was so large that the margin of error is very acceptable. And we'll see in a second what we got. So the question that I asked is, do we have data to support the assumption that it's a widespread problem on campus? Right? And remember, we're speaking about the Hillel professionals, the people that are not the students and not outside organizations. Now I'll go back to why we have these impressions. Here's an article in Mosaic, Anti-Semitism Goes to School, and this is by Ruth Liss, certainly a very respected scholar. Speaking about anti-Semitism on college campuses is rising and worsening. Okay. So that's one type of article. Now I want you to take a look at another article. Here's someone that already has the answer of what you do. Okay? The effective way to combat anti-Israel on campus, public relations. And what this individual, Joshua Ness, who's a consultant in public relations, he's very often on Fox News and places like that. He's speaking about an incredible growth of anti-Semitism on college campuses in North America. Now, some of you, when I asked, is there a big problem of anti-Semitism, you correctly asked, what do you mean by big? So I would ask, what does an incredible growth of anti-Semitism mean? So he answers the question himself right after, saying, according to the Anti-Defamation League, anti-Semitic incidents on college campuses in the United States increased by 21% in 2014 when compared to 2013. And herein lies, I picked this because here's a typical example of not believing what you read, even though it sounds correct. And it's published by a reputable person, a reputable place. Here's the press release about the 21%. What do you see there? It's the ADL speaking about 21%, but it says, not campuses. It mentions it, the United States in general. And it mentions the shooting in Kansas City, anti-Jewish expressions linked to the war in Gaza. This is the 21%. Yet, someone who did a quick read takes a look and takes that and says, well, you know, campuses are the ones that have the problem, and it's just not true. So what you have is this impression that creates a lot of reaction. And one of the reactions is to do something about it. So here's an example of one of the things that's done about it by one organization who put out this film called Crossing the Line, the New Face of Anti-Semitism on Campus. And if you look at this, as I did, and I look at these things, and this is what you see, you think this is the face, this is what's going on campuses in the United States, and this is what's happening. And it goes beyond this, to where you have individual incidents. I mentioned that the study that we did here is with the cooperation of the UCLA director. It was a very well-known incident that happened at UCLA. And the headline here, UCLA student faces anti-Semitism while seeking student government position. Now, I'll get into what people mean by anti-Semitism today when they speak about college campuses, as opposed to what I thought was anti-Semitism. Right? And we'll see that there's a difference in terms of what people are looking at today. But this was a student by the name of Rachel Beda. It was received a lot of press. Some of you may have heard of it. She was questioned about her Jewish identity. She was asked the question when she was applying for the position to be on the student senate, will your Jewish identity affect how you're going to vote? And this was made into an anti-Semitic incident, which it may have been, may not have been, but that was the incident. So I want to digress just for a second and move away from anti-Semitism and move away to bias in general on a campus in the United States. And I want to give you a little perspective of, other than anti-Jewish and anti-Israel incidents, what is happening today and how people who are involved in it see what's going on campus. Let's take a look at this. This is the Journal of Blacks in Higher Education. This is all that I presented here. But if I went to the actual web page, this scrolls down over and over and over and over again. So you see here, Boston University scholars tweet, create race controversy. Racial slurs written on a residence hall at Miami University. 2 white faculty members sue Alabama State University. Racial incident at the University of South Carolina. This goes on and on and on. So we tend, as every group, I suppose, and every family, does, to look at what's happening to us without looking at it in the general perspective of what's happening in general on a campus. So the people that are speaking about anti-Semitism very rightly are concerned about what's happening to Jews in Israel. But here we have a group of African Americans that are very much concerned about what's happening on campus with them. There's actually data that's collected on this, right? And here is FBI data going back to 2002 about racial incidents. And there's something they speak about anti-Semitic incidents in campus. But most of this is racial incidents of other things, Hispanics, women, other groups. So the anti-Israel and anti-Semitic behavior is one part of a general problem on campus of anti-other behavior. And it's actually been studied. Here are 2 journal articles in American journals speaking about factors associated with variation in racist hate crimes on college campuses. And they're not speaking about anti-Semitism. And the second one, hate crimes on campus, race, ethnic diversity, and campus safety. And they're not speaking about anti-Semitism or anti-Israel behavior. So I want to frame your thinking a bit as we look at this problem when it comes to Jews in terms of the general climate on campus. And here is another example, Fordham University. It's not known as a campus that has a lot of Jews. So there's not much activity there in terms of anti-Israel, anti-Semitic activity, yet they do have an office and for substance abuse prevention and student support, and they have bias-related incident hate crimes, and they have a whole policy on that, and it has nothing to do with Jews. So this problem exists. The problem of bias towards others, towards minorities, exists on campuses having nothing to do with Jewish behavior at all. Here we have Harvard being accused against Asian Americans. Again, just to give you a perspective. And of course, Muslim students. If you speak to Muslim students in the United States, they will tell you anti-Israel behavior on campus, there's anti-Muslim behavior on campus. Here's an incident where, in North Carolina, where 3 students were shot dead, allegedly because of anti-Muslim behavior. At least that was the accusation. We don't know if that's true or not, but we just put that there. So all this activity, we read in the press, and we see all this stuff that's coming out. And the JTA came out with a report a little bit a while ago, a couple of months ago, listing the top 10 campuses for anti-Semitic activity. Erroneously, they listed Columbia University as the #1 campus. It was listed by accident. They came out with a correction afterwards. But they said it's one of the top 10. And this was put out, sort of a group list, 10 colleges with worst anti-Semitic activity. Cornell was in there, Columbia was in there. And this got a lot of, I don't know if any of you have seen this, but this got a lot of play in the press and went all over the place. Another example of anti-Semitism that's on campus. Here's the correction that the article stated incorrectly that Columbia was listed as #1, Cornell was 2. It was actually in alphabetical order, was the correction they had. So Columbia started getting all this notoriety of being the #1 anti-Semitic campus, and it was just, I guess Amherst wasn't listed on there at all. So Columbia came up with that, and that's where it went. So where do we look to know really what's going on? So there was a study that was conducted a number of months ago by the Brandeis Center in Washington, not to be confused with Brandeis University, and Trinity College. And the survey showed a high rate of anti-Semitism on campus. So we say, well, here's your data. We have data, so it actually substantiates. Now, I want you to take a look a little bit at the data, and I'm going to point out some issues with the data and some reactions that other people had with it. But the evidence that they presented was that there's a big problem with anti-Semitism. Now here's the Brandeis Center. And this is before the study came out, and I'm just going to read you a quote on their website so you'll get an idea if we talk about Sarah Stern, President Endowment for Middle East Truth, with the rapid rise of campus anti-Semitism and anti-Israel incitement, which has reached epidemic proportions in the United States, etc., etc., etc. So they've already gone on record as speaking about a rapid rise, which may be true, speaking epidemic proportions. Now that's the language that's used here, and I think it's very important to keep that in mind. And that's the background I want you to keep in mind when you look at some of the results that they came out with. So here's the results. Student encounters with anti-Semitism. Right? There was no definition of what anti-Semitism is. Students were asked, have you had an anti-Semitic encounter? Anything occurred to you this year? Would you say you have witnessed or personally been subjected to anti-Semitism in any of the following contexts since the beginning of the academic year? And 51%, more than half the Jewish students in the United States said yes. Now, l'cha'ora, that's a very worrying statistic, when half come out. But if you go down and take a look, where they asked further questions about where did that anti-Semitism come from, I wonder if it's clear if you can see from an individual student, 29%. Club societies, 10%. Other contexts, 10%. Lecture class, 6%. Student union, 4%. University administrative system, 3%. So there's certainly no institutional anti-Semitism, but they said an individual student was the largest response, and they still didn't define what anti-Semitism is, what they mean by that. Okay? So let's go on. Take a look at the next. Okay? And this is where I think a lot of eyebrows were raised, because they, as part of their study, they said, well, not only is anti-Semitism a tremendous problem in the United States with students, it's worse in America than it is in England. And you take a look at that and you say, what did they really compare in terms of England? Well, they took the United States, they took this data that they had, they compared it to Jewish students answering a similar question 3 years ago in England, and they put it side by side, and they said, that's evidence that the problem of anti-Semitism on campus is worse in the United States than it is in England. Now, data is data, and data very often runs counterintuitive, as it well should, to what we think. But sometimes the counterintuitive is more counterintuitive than you could swallow and understand. And to say that the problem of anti-Semitism on campus in the United States is worse than it is in England somehow doesn't sit very well. And if you take a look at the rest of the data and how it went, you'll see what some of the problem is. Now here's the definition. Here's what they said themselves in this study. These are the Trinity College people. For many people, the term anti-Semitism arguably conjures up an image of a violent and highly emotive act committed by extremists, by neo-Nazis and other committed bigots. In other words, acts by hate-fueled individuals who subscribe to racist, anti-Semitic, homophobic, or other bigoted ideologies. Well, that makes sense to me, but that wasn't what they were measuring, right? What they said afterwards, our data suggests this is unlikely to be the typical case. Much of what Jewish students report can be categorized as low-level, in quotes, offenses such as insults, hostile leaflets, name-calling, and damage to property belonging to or sponsored by Jewish campus organizations, posters, graffiti, theft. There's a popular word that's running around in the United States on campuses these days that I just learned. It's called microaggression. I don't know if you heard what that is, but microaggression is anything that will hurt your feelings. Okay? And that's very popular on campus today. And to some degree, that may have been what was playing in this incredibly high data that you see over here. So people picked up on this. And a lot of people started looking at the data and started asking questions. One was an editorial in the forward that came out and said the anti-Semitism surge. That isn't. And they looked at this very study, and they mentioned a number of problems. The first problem was, and I don't know if you could read it, it wasn't a representative sample of Jewish students. It allowed the students to define anti-Semitism themselves. It left the term malleable, open to impression. And while its findings are disturbing, the authors themselves said, and this is what the authors themselves said, we don't know if there's a true trend or if this is noise. Okay? And they go on, interestingly enough, to say the Anti-Defamation League, which hardly downplays prejudice against Jews, keeps its own careful statistics and reports that there indeed is a trend. The number of anti-Semitic incidents on campus in 3 of the last 4 years, this is actually the lowest since the ADL kept track and started keeping track in 1999. Now, this is something you don't see. And this is one of the reasons that often when I teach, I tell my students, go look at a primary source. A primary source is not what a newspaper article tells you. It's checking out what the newspaper article says and then seeing if it's really there. So, unlike many of the articles that come out and speak about these tremendous rises in anti-Semitism, and I'm not downplaying it, and you'll see in a second what I mean by that, if you take a look at anti-Semitism, what the Ford editorial speaks about is largely a social phenomena. Students said that most of what they experienced did not come from professors in the classroom, administration officials, or student council meetings. Most of it was dumb, bad, offensive speech. That was it. And that's what they defined anti-Semitism as. So the problem that we have, and the problem that I had in speaking by the survey with the professionals, is really defining exactly what it is. What is anti-Semitism? And anti-Israel behavior? Is it the same or is it not? What's the frequency? What's the quality of it? Whose perception is valid? And something that I call organizational iatrogenics. If there's anyone here in healthcare, you'll know what I mean by iatrogenics. You know what iatrogenics is? When doctors cause the patient to be sick. Okay? And there's something that I think that's going on that I would call organizational iatrogenics, that it's curious that, well, we'll go on and you'll see what it is very easily. You'll see the data and you'll see where it comes. And you'll see what that may be. Now, let me go over the findings in general, and then I'll go over each question we asked one by one, and I'll see what it is. So the findings that we saw was that anti-Semitism and anti-Israel behavior exist on certain campuses, but almost always with only a small fraction of students. So it's a small amount of students on a small amount of campuses. That's number one. The impression that it's academic or ISIS is just not supported by the data of the Hillel professionals. They don't see it that way. Where it does exist, the topography, in other words, how it looks, what it is almost always nonviolent and isolated. Campus professionals, in a very large number, feel that advocacy organizations exaggerate the problem, and they feel that intervention on campus is required, what is a very popular word these days, nuanced programs, right? Whatever that means. But it means something different than what's out there now. The limitations of the study that we did, first of all, it's limited to the questions that we asked. It's limited to the sample that we asked. There may be errors involved there. We did not have the opportunity for a interview format to get more detail and get more feedback, although we did get comments that were solicited back from some individuals. And the margin of error is between 9 and 11, depending on the, which is usually large, but as you see from the strength of the answers, that it's highly acceptable within the studies that we have. So let me start off by showing you the first question that we asked, which is, anti-Semitic sentiment on my campus reflects the thinking of a small minority, a significant minority, a small majority, significant majority, or it doesn't exist at all. And what we found over here is, by far and away, most people thought that it's a small minority or significant minority. Nobody thought that even where it does exist, that reflects anything other than at most a significant minority. And here's the actual data. 61% a small minority, 10% significant minority. Nobody thought it was a small majority or significant majority, and close to a third thought that it's not a problem at all. We asked the same question of anti-Israel behavior. We got a little different answers over here, right? The same trend, but a little bit different, and this was reflected in some of the comments we got back from some of the professionals as well, where the numbers went up a little, including to 5% that this sample thought reflects anti-Israel behavior that's not anti-Semitic. Okay? And again, one of the things that disturbed some of the professionals that I got comments back from was that they didn't want to dichotomize between if you're anti-Israel, if you're anti-Semitic, you're anti-Israel, it's the same thing. They wanted to see that there's some sort of gradation between that. At least their feeling was that there are certain people on campus that are not anti-Semitic, but they have a legitimate objection to certain Israeli policies, and that has to be reflected, and you can't say both are the same. I think it's fair to say that in many cases both are the same, but I think we have to listen to what they're saying also, that at least in some cases, at least their impression, you know, these are the professionals on campus. There's a percentage, and here there's about 5%, they think that it's not the same. Okay. Let's go on to the next question. On a scale of 1 to 5, I'll just put this here so you can see it. I guess it's hard reading this, right? Impossible. So I'll just go over it. Scale of 1 to 5, where 1 doesn't exist and 5 is very high. Question was, what would you say is the level of actual anti-Semitic sentiment on your campus? Your impression of anti-Semitic activity on the USA campus in general. Then we asked the same question, what is the level of anti-Israel behavior on campus, and what is it in general? In short, what this shows is people think, my campus is not a problem, but on other campuses it is a problem. Right? That was the impression that they got, which could be reflective of somewhat of what you read, what's in the media, what they hear, but most people thought, you see over here, that none at all, insignificant. Then you see on other campuses, it starts going up. So people said, my campus is fine, the other campuses are not. That's the impression, which is interesting, and I guess we could do all kinds of drashot as to why it is that way or not. But what you found was about 15% felt that anti-Semitic activity was present on campus at a significant level, 15%, which also means that 85% felt that it wasn't. Okay? 28% of the respondents felt that anti-Israel activity was present at a significant level, but only 5% felt that a majority of students were anti-Israel, that were involved in anti-Israel behavior. Okay, so again, the limits of being able to find what the data actually showed that these people thought. Now the question that we asked is, what drives anti-Israel behavior on campus? Not anti-Semitic, anti-Israel behavior. What is it that drives? And we tried differentiating between Muslim students was one answer, students who are just regular students, students who belong to progressive or leftist organizations, or off-campus individuals. And I'll look at this because this I think is really, and we took it from none at all to very high. And you see that as far as ordinary students on campus, the overwhelming majority of Hillel professionals felt that they have nothing to do with anti-Israel behavior. Right, less than 2% maybe. But you do have large numbers with people that identify with progressive or revolutionary groups and Muslim students. That's where the anti-Israel activity is being driven by, not the ordinary Joe, college. Okay? And of significance also is the last choice, which is off-campus organizations that come in to drive it. So, to the degree that it does exist, on the 15% where it does exist, the Hillel professionals did not think this is a problem with the average student. It's a problem that's being driven by outside organizations and special interest groups, so to speak, on the campus. Then we asked the popular question. People talk, again, it's very popular in the States now to speak about feeling intimidated or unsafe. I feel unsafe. And unsafe does not mean physically unsafe. Unsafe means I'm uncomfortable with what you're telling me. And that's college lingo these days for feeling unsafe. And most of the people, most of the staff here, again, felt that that's highly exaggerated, that only 2% of the students that they come into contact with actually do report that they feel unsafe because of anti-Semitic or anti-Israel activity. Maybe another 2% definitively, another 6% moderately, but close to 85% of the students do not feel a problem with that at all. Again, this differentiates between the data that you see from the Trinity College students. Study rather. So now we ask the next question, and trying to figure out what exactly is anti-Semitic behavior when it happens on campus. What happens? Some of the things that you see in the press of incidents that have happened are graffiti, swastikas painted here and there. And you hear things like, oh, on this campus there's been a 50% increase in anti-Israel activity in the last year. Does that sound worrisome? Does it? So last year there was a guy on campus who's the main drive for the Students for Justice of Palestine. He managed to organize three events on campus last year, of which him and 5 students came out and put out placards. This year that same guy had 6 events on campus with 5 guys with placards. That's a 50% increase in anti-Israel activity. Okay, so I want you, and I'm telling you ma'aseh shahaya, right? So 100% increase, so that's horrible. So we have to be very careful, and if you look at the data of what came back from the professionals here, and the questions we asked, you see these big bars over here. So let's go over that, and you'll see what that actually is. When we asked, actual physical attack by an individual, isolated single occurrence, 16%. Actual physical attack by more than one individual, only 1 person responded. So physical attacks, in terms of anti-Israel, physical behavior is almost non-existent. Verbal abuse by an individual, look at that number. Repeated serial behavior, 54 and 16%. Those are very high numbers, they're in the 80s. By one individual. By more than one individual, it goes down to about 30 or 40%. Threats of physical harm, only 10%. Threats of physical harm by more than one individual, and this is only by an individual. By more than one individual, only 6%, and then 4% repeated behavior. In other words, what we see over here, when it comes to faculty member statements in class, an isolated incident here. So what we're seeing here is a tendency that certain behavior gets focused in on and blown out of the proportion that it is. Without trying to minimize what exists, it's important to really correctly define what exists. Otherwise, you're not able really, I mean, it's like in medicine. If you have a disease, it's very important to isolate where the disease is and treat the disease, and just don't go throw therapy all over the body and get nowhere. And I think that's what the Hillel professionals are saying. So one of the questions we asked them afterwards is, what do you think the faculty on your campus? Now, if I asked you, how is faculty on campus as far as anti-Israel behavior is concerned, what would you say your impression is? What? Would you say most faculty on campus are anti-Israel and pro-Palestine? Would you say that's the impression you get from reading the press?
Yes, in the humanities department.
Of course it depends. Of course it depends.
In the Middle Eastern Studies departments, yes. In the humanities departments, very strongly so.
So here's the data, at least from the Hillel professionals. We asked them. It turns out that pro-Israel, their impression of pro-Israel professors is 8%. Their Israel pro-Palestinian is 10%. Hardly any difference. What they do say is that most are interested in the issue, but are neutral or apathetic. Those are the numbers of what's actually there. The impression of Hillel professionals. These are the people that are in campus all the time. Next question we asked had to do with, remember that term that I put out, organizational iatrogenics? So we see from the data that they felt that a lot of the anti-Semitic, anti-Israel activity on campus is driven, at least in part, by outside organizations. So one of the questions that we were interested in is, to what degree do Jewish organizations press one way or another? And the question we asked is, based on your familiarity with promotional material put out, and based on the situation on your own campus, what would you say about pro-Israel national advocacy organizations? Do they underestimate the level of anti-Israel activity? Are they accurately portraying it? Do they somewhat exaggerate or significantly exaggerate? The data here, take a look, that either somewhat or significantly exaggerate. Over 70% of the Hillel professionals thought that the pro-Israel advocacy organizations on campus are exaggerating the problem. That's their impression of what's going on. I'll be happy to take questions. I just want to get through it. We had one more question that we put out there. We asked them, what's important to them as a campus professional? What is it that they, as campus professionals, what would they recommend in terms of intervention in whatever the issue is? And we asked them three questions. There's relatively little need on my campus for programs to help students understand the Israel-Palestinian dynamic. Only about 6%, 6.5% said that. National Israel advocacy organizations on campus adequately fill the need for helping students understand the Israel-Palestinian dynamic. 10% said that. And programs are needed, but they need to be more nuanced and considered of different perspectives with regard to the Israel-Palestinian dynamic. 82% said that. So when I speak about the margin of error is plus a 9 to 11, which is high, it's not high when you have data like this. Because even with the margin of error, even if you go down to 70% feel that way, that's pretty strong. And these are what this is what the Hillel campus professionals surveyed think. Just want to close by a couple of things. Some of you may be familiar with this. This is Alan Baker's paper on anti-Semitism. You can get it on the way out, I guess, or look it up on the website. But it talks about an active manifestation of anti-Semitism. And you read this, and you agree with this. These are the types of things. Expression of hostility or demonstration of violence towards Jews individually, publication, broadcasting material, acts of anti-Semitism, expression of speech, visual harassment, vandalism. These are the types of things that you think of anti-Semitism. But this is not what is happening, even in cases like UCLA, where the headlines were running around anti-Semitism because they asked Rachel Beda what her views were going to be on Israel because she's a Jewishly identified student. That's not the same. And there was an article that was published in Kfella, those of you who know the website, by Mayim Bialik, who's an actress, also a graduate of UCLA, who said UCLA isn't anti-Semitic, and she speaks about it, and she mentioned three things. And it's important. And she mentioned that she wrote the article as a mother. This is what I teach my students, my children. Number one, anti-Semitism is everywhere. It's unfortunate, but it is. Unfortunately, a lot of students don't realize that in whatever environments they grew up with in the United States. And then when they get to see it, they get all excited over it. Number two, UCLA is not an anti-Semitic university. This was one incident with one group of people that quickly reversed their decision because of three people on the board, and it changed. And third, the student government has held itself accountable to this incident, and they reversed it very quickly. So, what is really going on campuses? What is really going on? So, I want to bring your attention to something that Condoleezza Rice called the swaddled generation. All right? This was a talk she gave last year, commencement exercise speech. And that's when this whole thing about, she makes me feel uncomfortable, it's a microaggression, that type of speech went out. And what I think is going on, and you see this is an article written by Kathleen Parker in the Washington Post, speaking about trigger warnings that you have on campus. I don't know how many of you are familiar with what trigger warnings are. If a professor is going to be speaking about a subject that may be offensive to certain people, there's a sign outside the lecture hall, trigger warning, you may be offended by what you hear inside there. So for all the talk about free speech and open, etc., now you have safe zones. You have safe zones that you're not going to speak about certain things. And Jewish students are not immune to that. So here she speaks, a trigger warning is conveyed on a sign or posted near an auditorium. The speech is to be given, alerting students to the possibility that the speaker may express an idea that could trigger an emotional response. Okay? This is the campus of the United States today. This is what you have out there. Now let's take a look at some of the data, and then we'll be finished with the questions. The ADL spoke about anti-Semitic activity, and 47 incidents on 43 campuses. That's it. Now take a look at what was in 1984 and 1995. 1984 and 1985 was over 100. 2014 is down to 40. Yet, the impression that people have is that, as Ruth Riss wrote, it's increasing at an alarming rate.
Today you have YouTube.
Today you have YouTube. That's what I say. I mean, I don't have that. So, and the 2014 anti-Semitic incidents reported to us in 2014 came from just 1% of colleges. 1%. Now, if I go back and show you some of the data about anti-black incidents and anti-Hispanic incidents and anti-Asian incidents, you'll find numbers that are larger than that on campuses. So what's really going on? The question could be that the data, at least the data of these Hill professionals, is, here's a little Dilbert cartoon that, I got the data, multiply 0 times 100 is still 0, and, maybe off on the wrong track. So it could be that the data is incorrect. Could be. And it's really dangerous to repeat conclusions based on inaccurate data, but that works both ways. The Hill study may be wrong, but what if the Hill study is right and all the other studies are wrong? Right? And the reason I tend to put a little bit more credence into the Hill data is that this was an anonymous survey done by people that are probably most familiar with the campus, who live it, who are there, who know the students, who know the faculty, know the culture, know the campus, and are there throughout a period of time, and not there just for a short period of time and then leave. So if you go back again, you take a look at ADL data, you see college campus, in terms of anti-Semitism in the United States, it's only they're talking about, in the public area, only 7%. And that most of the anti-Semitism is not on the college campus, it's in other areas, public area. Jewish schools, well, I guess that's graffiti on a Jewish school or something. That doesn't mean it's a Jewish school. So they themselves talk that the incidents are certainly disturbing, but it is important to note that these incidents are relatively rare, and the vast majority of students feel safe on campuses. When such incidents do occur, they are generally condemned by administrators and the wider campus communities that respect them. This is just a few weeks ago, by the ADL. So when we get involved into sitting around the coffee table or handing around a kiddush after shul and speaking about horrible things that happen. I know it happens to me when I go to the States. People, talk about what's going on campuses. I think it's important to take a look at the data and to see what's there. And I think it's also important, in terms of Jewish education, to teach people what anti-Semitism is and what it means. Now, I don't know if this quote is true or not true. Maybe Effie could tell me if it's true or not. Anti-Semitism is nothing but the antagonistic attitude produced by non-Jews, in non-Jews by the Jewish group. This is a normal social reaction. That's what I say. Now, many people think there's anti-Semitism. What's new? Of course there's anti-Semitism. But it's all relative. But in terms of a normal social reaction of anti-Semitism, this is something that exists, and I think many of our students on campus are not used to the fact that anti-Semitism is a normal phenomenon that exists, and that every time something happens, it's not the time to go having an over-exaggerated reaction. Because then you have over-exaggerated resources, it changes the whole dynamic of what you have over there. So I'm not the only person that says it. Foxman is resigning, retiring, and he's saying the same thing. But you find people that get angry. And here you have an organization. Here I'm talking about organizational iatrogenics. Here's an article, a front page magazine, that says ADL rushes to defend campus anti-Semites. So when people are going to have a reaction to that because people question the data, right? Now this is something that I think is cause to take a look at what we put in print. And before you put something in writing, you really have to think twice. Certainly think twice before you think about the ADL defending anti-Semites on campus. And here's another article. ADL condemns mounting hysteria. So there are organizations that it appears have an interest in fanning the flames and trying to show that it's worse than it is. And there are organizations that are based on looking at the data and having a more reasoned outlook in terms of how you would go about taking a look at the data. So the question that I have when I look at all this is, are we lowering the standard of what anti-Semitism is? And I think, anti-Semitism is real, but we have to be really serious when we say anti-Semitism. We shouldn't be lowering the standard of what we expect. It's not somebody asking a question of a student, oh, you're Jewish, is that going to affect how you're going to vote on BDS? Which is probably a legitimate question. It's a legitimate question to ask everybody that same question. We don't know. We don't have data on that. We don't have data on that. But if you ask the Muslims, they would probably say we go through that as well. But to say that it's a boorish question, it's an insensitive question, it's a question that was out of context, it was a question that shouldn't have been asked, okay. But to say that that's evidence of epidemic proportions of anti-Semitic behavior on American campuses, I think takes another leap. So I'm just going to conclude and then open up in terms of conclusions. If it's correct, based on the data, just based on this data, that it exists on campus, there's no question that there's anti-Semitism and anti-Israel behavior. It's a minority phenomenon where it does exist. It's mostly boorish, verbal, ignorant behavior. It's isolated incidents, serious but isolated incidents. It seems to be exaggerated. The feeling among the Hillel professionals is don't conflate anti-Israel with anti-Semitism. Some of it overlaps, some of it does not overlap. So I think if there's one thing you conclude over here is, what I see from this is that there are anti-Semites on campus, but not necessarily anti-Semitism. I don't know if anyone understands what I mean by that, but that's essentially what the data seems to say here. So the question is, where do we go from here? And what we do, we hope to share this data with organizations to the degree that they're willing to take a look at it and see what they should do about it. But and to do more studies and follow up. As I said, the comments that we got from the professionals seem to reflect this more than anything else. They're feeling that not everyone who's anti-Israel is an anti-Semite. And I think it's an important message that we should take from them. They're saying it. It's not my opinion, not anyone else's opinion. It's what they're saying in general. And I think it's important to say. Thank you.